Hey, thanks for coming by, Brian for Liberty. Today we are going to be talking about creeping authoritarianism, Joe Rogan, and what's going to be the next big thing after the pandemic is finally in our rearview mirror. One thing that we definitely need to talk about is how we got here in the first place. And how we got here in the first place is an absolute attack on every institution in this country for 4 years by the Democrats, by the losers of the election. For 4 years, we couldn't trust the election results. Sound familiar? For 4 years, everybody was a racist. For 4 years, everything was terrible. And it was all coming unwound. And we couldn't trust anybody or anything. Now, here we are with a vaccine, with 3 vaccines, and the people would rather listen to a UFC announcer, podcaster, former comedian than the trusted institutions of this country. And you want to blame Trump and you want to blame the right, but the bottom line is you did this. For 4 years, you eroded trust, and you did it because you were sowing the seeds just in the event that Trump actually would have won re-election. You were preparing to try and undermine his presidency. I'm going to share an article with you right here, and you tell me I'm wrong. You just go ahead. I'm going to share this article. Democrats fear Trump will rush unsafe vaccine to help his re-election bid. This is from the Huffington Post. It's dated September 15th, 2020. Democrats are very suspicious of President Donald Trump's big promises to develop and bring to market a vaccine for the coronavirus before the end of the year. They fear the president and his political appointees at the Department of Health and Human Services will pressure scientists, regulators, and drug makers into releasing an insufficiently safe or effective vaccine in order to help bolster Trump's re-election chances in November. Republicans, meanwhile, say Democrats, just listen to this. Republicans, meanwhile, say Democrats are guilty of sowing doubt about a potential vaccine by engaging in what they've called unfounded and irresponsible conspiracy theories driven primarily by Democrats' opposition to Trump. Republicans accusing Democrats about spreading conspiracy theories about a vaccine. It's like the Twilight Zone, and nobody even remembers it. Nobody even thinks, and you go do your search online for Democrats pre-election talking about the vaccine and essentially talking about how they would not take a vaccine that came out under Donald Trump. This is the same vaccine. And the only reason Democrats are on board with it now is because Biden happens to be in the White House. Don't even pretend that you wouldn't be doing, that Democrats would not be doing exactly what Republicans, exactly what the right is doing right now, which is sowing doubt and confusion about the vaccines to undermine their effectiveness. They were doing it before the election even happened. Just think about that. The roles were completely reversed. Then Biden won, and now all of a sudden the vaccine is this, and anybody speaking out or with any hesitancy over the vaccine is a conspiracy theorist, is a far-right conspiracy theorist, is a racist, whatever you want to call them. That's who the anti-vax people are now. And you can't sit there and pretend that the anti-vax people wouldn't have been the Democrats had Trump won re-election. And what this really all means to me is it's very important for us all to set aside our preconceived notions, our preconceived beliefs, stop being ideological, stop being tribal, and try and think on our own. Stop paying attention to who's presenting the information and try and focus on the information being presented. Look for hypocrisy. We're not going to save or turn back what's going on in this country until we get to a place where we hold those people that we trust every bit as accountable as the people we do not trust. Now, I did talk a little bit in the intro here about creeping authoritarianism. I'm trying to track down an article here. I got it right here. This is, you know what? I'm going to get to that closer to the end. I want to bring up something else first. This is taking place in Canada. And this is, so if you're paying attention to the news, you're probably seeing the Freedom Convoy, the truckers who are protesting in Canada against mandates for truck drivers. Estimates anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 trucks, tons of involvement, shutting down the border. A huge, massive protest taking place in Canada right now. And this is an interesting article coming from the Washington Post and coming from an American newspaper. This is terrifying to me a little bit. Opinion. Canada must confront the toxic Freedom Convoy head on. So let's get into this article. Long lines of truckers calling themselves the Freedom Convoy are headed across Canada to Ottawa from the west and from the east. Estimates of the size of the convoy vary. I won't estimate. Bigger than a breadbasket, smaller than Hadrian's Wall. Hundreds of trucks and personnel vehicles by some estimates. Now, hundreds. He's saying, I've seen estimates as high as 50,000 trucks. I've seen estimates even higher than that. I would definitely say far more than hundreds if you're seeing the photos online. Just do your own searches on Google, and you'll see the images. It's far more than just hundreds. Here's the interesting part about this. The movement shares an affinity with Trumpist, toxic authoritarianist politics. Indeed, the convoy has received attention from Donald Trump Jr. Police and security services are preparing for the worst as experts express concern about the online vitriol and journalists covering the convoy are harassed. The convoy has received attention from Donald Trump Jr. Shares an affinity with Donald Trump, toxic authoritarianist politics. These are people protesting government mandates, and the language is being twisted that they're the authoritarians, that they support authoritarianism. Language is important. The fact that the Washington Post is taking this and saying, if you oppose a government mandate, essentially you're the authoritarian, is turning language on its head in an attempt to intentionally tie it with something that's unpopular with half of Americans. I'm guessing, and I obviously don't have access to poll data, other than what I read, and a lot of the mainstream media I don't trust. But I would surmise that less than half of Americans support mandating, actually forcing a person to take a vaccine. I can't believe even your most ardent supporters of the vaccine, ardent supporters of masks, people who have higher levels of fear over the virus, I find it hard to believe that most Americans support forcing you to inject something into your body. I just don't believe I believe that's a large reason that Joe Biden is so unpopular right now, aside from some of the economic issues, is that mandate, that OSHA mandate, is being reflected, its unpopularity is being reflected in the polls as him being such an unpopular president. I don't know that coming out of a pandemic and a shutdown that the American people are going to hold the economic performance against him. And I really feel like he's feeling the heat from trying to mandate this stuff. But comparing these people to authoritarians when they're protesting mandates is a language trick. And it's just terrifying to me because there are people who are going to read this and they're going to look at you as a person who wants medical freedom and say, you're the totalitarian, you're the authoritarian. And that's very troublesome to me because I see Americans falling for that kind of language all the time and how that could control the narrative. And I think it's a real shame that we're going to take people who are protesting for greater freedom and try and paint them as the authoritarians. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Joe Rogan podcast. It really bothers me that we're having a national debate about a podcast hosted by a former comedian, UFC personality. Look, he does a great show. He has some really good guests on. But the fact that this has risen to national debate level, the reason I'm bothered by that is the fact that we don't trust any of our institutions anymore. We can't trust any of these places as reliable sources of information, and they've done it to themselves. And here is an opportunity with a very popular podcaster with a very large audience to say, okay, this guy's putting out this information and we don't think it's right. We think it's dangerous that he's putting this information out. And instead of trying to silence him, let's go on there and have this conversation and let's create a dialogue so we can create a better understanding. You're not bringing people into the fold. You're not making them trust you more by trying to silence the people who are questioning you. The people who are listening to Joe Rogan, the people who are listening to that podcast and taking it seriously are people who already have a lack of faith in what the main narrative of this whole thing is. And so by trying to silence the people who are questioning you, all you're doing is creating higher levels of distrust in the people you need or you claim to want to trust you the most. Reaching out and having conversations is a much better way than trying to silence people who don't agree with your opinions or your conclusions. The fact of the matter is that science is complicated. It's meant to be questioned and it's always growing. And look, I'm not a guy who thinks that there's some grand conspiracy here behind the vaccinations. What I will say, what really does bother me is that nobody seems to want to follow the money. Nobody seems to go, hey, these are multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies who we have accused of putting the bottom line above public health for years, we've been criticizing them for this. And then every single time what appeared to be a cost-effective, readily available treatment seemed to come to light, the first thing we did was destroy that. And the only way to combat this, the only medical treatment acceptable for this pandemic is the vaccine. And that seems unrealistic to me that we can come up with an actual vaccine in such a compressed time schedule, but we can't come up with a cost-effective therapeutic to treat it. That seems to me very, very questionable. I think there's good reasons for suspicion when we talk about hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, these things that are already they've already been tested. We know they're dangerous. People can take them. The idea that there's no other way to treat this other than taking the vaccine, that every other avenue is being shunned, seems to me that you have a pharmaceutical conglomerate or pharmaceutical industry that's predominantly focused on profits. They fund the politicians and they pay and sponsor these media outlets. So the idea that we can't question that narrative seems to me very, very suspicious. And the fact of the matter is, again, if these people want to gain the trust of the people who question them the most, silencing voices isn't the way to do that. That only creates more distrust. Go on the show, have the conversation, refute this stuff in the same form and reach the same audience, because these people aren't listening to you, but they're listening to the podcast. So go on there and speak to these people. If it's that important, if it's that critical to put this pandemic behind us, if it's that important, then go on that show and have that conversation. Don't try and silence the voice, because you're just creating more distrust, which is literally what you're telling us we need to eliminate. So that's my big issue with the Joe. I'm not going to get into the science. I'm not going to argue. I'm not a scientist. I'm not getting into any of that. I just look at it as it's your fault we don't trust you. And trying to silence these voices is just creating more distrust. So I would love to see some of these experts go onto his and refute these things and give those people both sides of the argument. Because there are two sides, no matter what any scientist says, there are two sides of the argument. And if one side's wrong, you shouldn't fear that. You should be able to go in and confront that head on. So that's my show. I know it took me a while to get this one out. For those of you who made it to the end, thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming by. I will be back with more headlines, more news stories, and we will talk to you later.